Hi, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Carolyn West. She's in the psychology department at University of Washington Tacoma. She teaches there. She helped start that program there. She's also a practicing clinical psychologist. She does work around domestic violence. She also does work around images of African American women, ways in which those images, historically and presently, can be destructive, ways in which they might even be constructive. So listen to her talk as she talks about images of African American women, about partner violence, and about domestic violence. She's also doing her talk during a period that is considered Domestic Violence Month. So she's also doing really important work for our community, and particularly during this time of COVID-19. I have a couple of questions for you based on her talk. One is, what is the myth of the Superwoman? How can that myth be both helpful and constructive? What are some ways in which that Superwoman myth is problematic? You can either choose, is it helpful or is it problematic? But the myth of a Superwoman, what is it? And is it helpful? Is it problematic? What are some of the tensions that we find in the myth of the Superwoman? The second question I have for you, and this is from Dr. West, our psychologist, as we look into 2021, as we look past 2020, what are some ways, what are some habits, and what are some things that you can do to keep yourself healthy and well, and to keep your community healthy and well? As you look to 2021, what are some ways in which you can keep yourself healthy and well, and what are some ways in which you can keep others healthy and well as we look to the future? Thank you for doing such a great job with this class, and thanks for hanging in there. Stay healthy and stay well. Take good care, everyone.
So hello, my name is Dr. Carolyn West, and welcome to 2020, the course, and 2020, the year. And what an amazing year it has been. I am actually a clinical psychologist here at the University of Washington in Tacoma. And I came here in 1997 to start a psychology program. The campus actually started in the year 1990, but I came in 1997 to start the psychology program. And so a common question I get about my work is, what do I do here at UWT? So in the last couple of decades, I teach a variety of interesting courses, including the psychology of Black women. I teach a human sexuality course, a family violence course, a sexual violence course, and I even teach a sexual deviance course. So a common question I get there is, well, what is sexual deviance? It's a combination of human sexuality and abnormal psychology. So I teach a variety of very interesting courses here in Tacoma. And oftentimes students ask me, well, how did you get to be doing this particular work? Well, it's a long story. I'm a first generation student, and everybody's path is different. But how I really got to be able to do this work is that I did a bachelor's and a master's degree at the University of Missouri in St. Louis. And then after that, I ended up going to the University of Notre Dame, where I did my clinical internship. And so what is a clinical internship? That's another common question as well. It's that year when you're finishing up your PhD and you go and you do clinical work full time, and you really learn what it means to be a clinical psychologist. So I did that for a year. I saw clients. I worked in a mental health facility and in the University Counseling Center. And then after that, I went to Illinois State University and did a year there as a postdoc. So that's what you do after you earn your PhD and you want to get even more education. So I spent a year there doing clinical work and teaching in the psychology department. And then after that, did a second postdoctoral fellowship at the University of New Hampshire, where I focused on family violence research. So a little bit about my background and what brought me to UWT. So the other question that students oftentimes ask me, well, what do you do when you're not teaching? Well, I do a variety of things when I'm not teaching. I spend a lot of time writing. I publish articles, book chapters on violence in the lives of mostly women, particularly the most marginalized women, African American women. And I do trainings and workshops and seminars and keynotes all around the country on this topic. So I actually get a chance to train advocates and activists and lawyers and judges and police officers about domestic violence. And then I spend a great deal of time, actually more time these days, working as an expert witness on domestic violence cases. So it's my job oftentimes after a victim has killed her intimate partner to go into the courts and explain, well, maybe what happened here, and why was this person especially vulnerable, and why did this crime happen, and why was it so hard for her to escape that particular violence. So that's how I spend a great deal of my time. So these days, a common question I get is, how has my work been impacted since COVID happened a few months ago? Well, it's been an interesting time, as it has for lots of people right now, and some good things, some not so good things. So when COVID started, I actually was on sabbatical. And so a sabbatical is when you're in the middle of your academic career and the university gives you this time to really take off and focus on one particular project. It could be writing a book, working on a documentary. So I took the year off to focus on writing, so I tended to be home a lot anyway, and then the pandemic happened, and then I couldn't leave. And so at the time, it felt like my world had gotten really, really small. But here's what I learned from COVID, and here's how it shaped the work that I'm doing these days. I learned several things, actually, and although it seemed like my world, the first thing I learned was, although it seemed like my world had gotten much smaller, I quickly learned that it actually had gotten much bigger, that my time had just expanded and I had gotten more busier than I had ever anticipated being before COVID hit. So I actually started doing things like I started writing opinion pieces for newspapers and blog posts, which then led to me being able to do national television to talk about my research in a way that I had never anticipated would happen. And as I look at the images here, I actually started doing more podcasts. Everybody was home, and people were listening to more podcasts. So I started getting invited to do podcasts, different podcasts on a weekly basis with several organizations to give me more of a chance to talk about my research. The second thing I started doing was Facebook Live interviews and webinars and keynotes. So the first way that COVID has really shaped the work that I'm doing is that I found that it actually made my world bigger and not smaller. And that opened up, I started doing virtual documentary screenings, which went global, which gave me a chance to work with people in Australia, people that I would have never met because they wouldn't have been able to attend my workshops otherwise. So that's one way. I think the second way COVID has impacted my work is that I realized that everybody was having a sense of fear and frustration and loneliness and grief and loss. And so being able to share those experiences with other people so I could be a support to them and they could be a support to me actually helped me realize how important it is to live a life that's less full with fear. Realizing that time is really short and you never really know how much time you have. So instead of being fearful about what's coming next, to really embrace what's coming next and to take chances, I think, that I wouldn't have been willing to take in the past with my research in my life if it had not been for COVID. And probably the third way that COVID has shaped my career and the work that I'm doing these days is that I actually learned a new metaphor for life, and it's called watering the bamboo. And this was sort of established by a former basketball player, an attorney, and he was doing leadership training. And he talked about it's important to water your bamboo. And when one of my mentors said that to me, I didn't quite understand what he meant, but what he explained was that with certain types of bamboo, you can water that bamboo for a year and nothing happens. And then you water it for a second year and nothing happens. And then a year after that, 3, 4, sometimes as many as 5 years before you actually see growth. And so that became a really good metaphor for how I think of my own career now. And I actually keep bamboo on my desk now to remind myself of that things that it may seem for many years that you're investing in your education or your career and nothing seems to really be happening. But if you continue to tend to it, focus on the things that light you up and the things that give you passion, and you continue to focus on those, even though it may not seem like things are happening, sometimes around the 4th or even 5th year, that bamboo can sprout up. In 60 days, it can grow as much as 90 feet tall. And so that has become a way that COVID has really shaped the work that I'm doing these days. So in part 2 of this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about my work on domestic violence, and my work in part 3, I'll talk to you about my work on images of Black women in the media and how all of those things have been shaped by COVID. All right, so I'm Dr. West, and this is 2020, the course. And so this month is particularly important to me because it's October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And I'm a clinical psychologist by training, but I'm also a domestic violence and sexual assault researcher. And so October is a time where we really focus on the experiences of victims and survivors of domestic violence. So a common question I get asked all the time is, well, what is domestic violence? So we know that it's broader than physical abuse. It oftentimes involves physical abuse, but not necessarily. It also involves verbal abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, so name calling, threats, isolation of the survivor. It involves financial abuse. It can also involve sexual abuse. So domestic violence is a pretty damaging, broad concept that impacts a large number of the global population. And what we're seeing now is with COVID, we're seeing even more of that. And it's not something that just impacts individuals or certain families. We're seeing in France, for example, domestic violence has increased about 30% since the lockdown. In Singapore, more calls to domestic violence hotlines. In Argentina, more emergency calls. And of course, in the United States, we're seeing more shelter requests. And we're seeing problems with domestic violence globally. So this is not a new problem that just came about with COVID. It's been happening everywhere for a really long time. So we're actually seeing in King County, what we're finding just in our area, we're seeing an uptick. In King County, has already seen 13 domestic violence homicides in 2020. And the year is not even over yet. And we're seeing even more severe intimate partner violence. And that's happening here in Pierce County where I live as well. So much of my life has actually been devoted to understanding the dynamics of domestic violence. So early in 2000, I wrote a book, Violence in the Lives of Black Women, Battered, Black and Blue. And I worked with a group of social workers, activists, people in the faith community, survivors to write about their experiences. So I take a very interdisciplinary approach to understanding or trying to understand intimate partner violence. And I focus now more with the media, talking about media cases. high-profile media cases of intimate partner violence. In this particular story, I talked about Megan Thee Stallion, who is a rapper, singer, who was shot by an acquaintance of hers and injured. And what are the stereotypes that exist throughout our culture that made it just so much more difficult for us to have conversations about how that violence impacted her life? So much of my research focuses there. And so, not to say that African American women are inherently more violent. Anybody could be a victim of domestic violence. It could be same-sex couples, it could be men who are victims, it can happen in dating relationships, people who are divorced, people who are married. It happens throughout our culture. I spend much of my time focusing on African American women because it's important for us to talk about how is it similar for African American women without being so colorblind that we miss important differences. But then how is it really different? And we talk about those differences without reinforcing the stereotypes that we really don't want to end up reinforcing and then being very damaging. So I spend much of my research on those things. And I think with COVID, as my research has expanded, there are three important things that I'm starting to unpack with my research these days. Probably the first thing is we have to take a more intersectional approach to doing this work. And this graph, there looks like there's a lot going on here, but I think it really represents intersectionality. We have to understand how does sexual orientation shape the experience that you will have? How does your immigration status shape that experience? How does race shape that experience? All African Americans don't identify with tracing their ancestors to the historic slave trade, for example. How does being an African immigrant shape your experience? How does being Caribbean American shape your experience? How does being differently abled and having physical or mental health challenges shape your experience? How does poverty shape your experiences? How does your gender identity shape your experiences with intimate partner violence, particularly being transgender? What we're actually finding, again, as 2020 comes to an end and we're looking at the statistics, we're actually finding that there has been an uptick in all forms of violence, particularly against transgender women of color, particularly Latinx and African American transgender women of color. And if we understand intersectionality, that would make sense, because here's a population that's living at the intersection of multiple forms of discrimination based on race, economics, gender identity, which means they're more vulnerable to being victimized, not only within their intimate partner relationships, but also in the community that they live, in institutions when they seek help. So they're facing quite a bit more challenges, life challenges, which increases the probability that they'll experience intimate partner violence and decreases the probability that they'll be able to get the assistance and help they need. So if we understand intersectionality, we can move our discussion forward and provide better services to everyone, I think. I think if we can really start to craft systems that really speak to the experiences of the most marginalized people, we can have systems that work better for everybody. So intersectionality has become, having conversations around intersectionality has become much more important to me in the research that I do. And as we're living through a time of not only COVID, but we're living through a time of social justice movements like the Black Lives Matter movement, it's important that when we have those discussions, we don't forget to talk about gender-based violence. So intimate partner violence, sexual assault, And then we're having the Me Too movement that's dealing with all types of gender-based violence. And it's important that women of color and Black women and trans women aren't left out of those discussions when we talk about gender. And so if we do an intersectional analysis, we can make sure that we more fully capture the experiences of all the women and people of all gender backgrounds that we're hoping to serve as we do this work. The second thing I think we need to do, or that I'm trying to do as I do my research going into the future, is to put intimate partner violence in the context of other types of abuse. So in other words, I focus on African American women because they also experience not only high rates of intimate partner violence, but they also experience high rates of different types of intimate partner violence. So just like Megan Thee Stallion, they're more likely to be shot and actually killed by an intimate partner. African American women are also more likely to be strangled. So they're more likely to be choked by an intimate partner. So why different types of violence tend to show up in our lives, and having conversations about that. But not only doing that, but also putting that violence within historical trauma. And I'll talk more about historical trauma in part 3 of this and how that's shaped who we are. But how does slavery, how that has shaped society in terms of economic inequalities, for example, how does that historical trauma shape the violence that Black women experience in their contemporary relationships even now? So also talking about structural violence. Structural violence are things like homelessness, poverty, and other lack of resources. Those are all types of structural violence, and we're seeing more of that now with COVID because people have lost jobs and they've lost housing. So African American women and many people now are having to deal with their intimate partner violence within the context of structural violence, also institutional violence. Institutional violence is what happens when you're seeking help from these institutions, the medical community, the legal community, and then you're met with more violence. So we find that Black women are more likely, for example, to actually be arrested when they're seeking help after they've been victimized. So those are forms of institutional violence. So if we can understand that as well. And then community violence. So imagine you're experiencing violence in your home, and then you're living in a community where there's a large amounts of violence as well. So you're trying to manage all of this while you're just trying to manage your life. And so having conversations about how all those forms of violence shape what we're seeing is my next plan. So really trying to unpack what it means to be experiencing historical trauma. And I explain to people what I mean by historical trauma is it's this collective, spiritual, psychological, emotional, and cognitive distress that's perpetrated intergenerationally, that comes from multiple experiencing, originating during slavery, but continuing into the present day. So what we're experiencing with racial justice movements, where we're seeing now people being arrested, people being killed when they're arrested, and seeing that on videotape and having that replayed throughout our society, that compounds that historical trauma and makes things even worse. So how do we unpack that in the context of intimate partner violence as well? So that's the second thing we have to do, is we need to widen our lens when we talk about intimate partner violence, not just think about it within the context of relationships, but throughout society. And probably the third thing that we need to do that I'm most excited about these days is I think if we want to address intimate partner violence, and we really want to strive towards social justice, the way that we have to do that is that we have to start changing systems in a way that work for survivors. That means what that would look like is not just telling them, here are the services that we can provide to you, but asking them, what services do you need and how can we make that work for you, and crafting services that work for them. So my next project is working with Survivors First. So we're working with the YWCA and we're working with the prosecutor's office to look at when survivors come in and they use intimate partner violence, or they use violence, or they get involved in criminal activity, to really start asking, well, what contributed to them being in the legal system in the first place? So maybe arrest and throwing people in jail is maybe not the system, because that doesn't seem to be working so well. So maybe what we need to do next is to say, let's maybe connect this person to services and then help them to not be in the legal system in the first place. So that is what I'm most inspired by with COVID, has really inspired me to really get in and see now is the time to make systemic changes. So in lecture 3, we'll talk some about how images in the media shape what we're seeing now, historical images and contemporary images, and how COVID and racial justice has shaped that. Okay, welcome to part 3 of the lecture 2020, the course. So in addition to doing research on domestic violence, I also do research on images of Black women in the media historically, and how those images shape what we're seeing in contemporary times. And so my goal is to really unpack the psychological implications of those images. And so the article that I provided for you for background reading is Mammy, Sapphire, Jezebel, and the Bad Girls of Reality Television, Media Representations of Black Women. And so one thing I enjoy is doing documentary film work. And so I've worked on a number of documentaries, my own, looking at sexualized media, but also documentary films in Canada where we talk about the history of these images. And so there's an image of me working on a Canadian documentary on this topic. So that's what I want to spend some time talking to you about in this lecture, is what all of this means. So let's go back. And what we found is that one thing that's happened with social justice movements now is that one thing I had not anticipated was after George Floyd was killed by the police, I knew that things would change in some pretty dramatic ways, but I didn't anticipate that after that event, people would really start looking more carefully and more critically at images throughout our culture. And now, as of October 2020, more than 100 Confederate symbols and monuments have fallen in this country, and people have almost taken it upon themselves to remove those images. So schools have been renamed. The flag of Mississippi, the Confederate battle flag, was taken out of their state flag. So lots of things have changed, and people are more aware of that historical trauma and what those images mean. And so what has happened, so throughout our culture, we're really starting to look at these images. Now, I focus some of my time and attention on sexualized media images of African American women, and those are deeply rooted, and you'll see that in the reading material that I provided for you. But what was interesting, the summer of 2020, one of the most popular songs was a song by Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion, just a major hit, millions of downloads, and people were singing this all over the country. And it was called WAP, Look It Up. Just look it up on your own. I don't think I need to tell you about more of what that, and you can unpack that at your leisure. But she came underneath a lot of criticism because of that, the video and the song. And she said, okay, it's really a song for adults because of the sexual content. And she explained that, well, this is really what people want to hear. And people asked, well, would you want your 2-year-old to hear this? And she was like, well, not exactly. It's really a song for adults. And some people saw it as a feminist masterpiece and a celebration of female sexuality. Other people saw it as pornography. So some of my work focuses on how do you craft a healthy sexuality in the context of these media images, and what is pornography and what is real sexual liberation. So part of my research focuses on that. I've also fascinated about other historical images, particularly the image of, I never thought that this would happen, but the image of Aunt Jemima has been a long fascination of mine. And so I actually collect Black memorabilia because I am deeply interested in how those images have unfolded. So after the George Floyd incident, people actually started to come out and they started to criticize the image of Aunt Jemima. Now, this image has been around for more than 130 years. People actually thought Aunt Jemima was a real person, and she actually wasn't. This kind of image of Black women being mammies and caregivers was deeply rooted. Most of it arose after slavery ended, actually. And this notion that Black women were on plantation households, they were well fed, they were sort of asexual caregivers, and they had no emotional needs of their own. And so after slavery ended, it was kind of a longing for the old South. So a lot of marketers started using this image to sell products. So what happened is that you would see this mammy image everywhere. This is actually a burlap sack for baking material. And the image of mammy was very prominent, and they actually even called it like a mammy brand. And so this was an old burlap sack that I had sort of put in a frame so that I could take a look at it all the time. And then you also saw this image everywhere. This was a bank. There were cookie jars, there were banks, there were all kinds of products that included this kind of mammy caregiver image. And so the Aunt Jemima image actually came about in 1889 when Chris Rutt, it was a marketing strategy. He had gone to something called a minstrel show at the time. Minstrel shows were where white people would dress up in blackface and they would mimic the dances and the behaviors of what historically stereotypical Black people were supposed to be like. And he said, that's like a great image for my self-rising pancake mix. And he made up a story of an enslaved woman who had helped a Confederate soldier flee during the Civil War, and she saved him by feeding him these wonderful pancakes. And then after the Civil War, he came back and he said, well, you saved my life, and I want to share your pancakes with the world. Can you sell me your recipe? And she said, no, it's been in my family for hundreds of years, but I'll go around the world with you and share my pancake messages, my pancakes with everyone. And so it was a totally made up story. So they hired an African-American woman, Nancy Green, to play the first Aunt Jemima, and she went around and she did this. And so what ended up happening is that they put this on marketing materials for hundreds of years, and they call them aunt. You didn't call Black people oftentimes, you would either call them by their first name or aunt or uncle. And so it's a deeply racist sort of term. So here's one of the earlier images of Aunt Jemima and what the product looked like. And then over time, it was a big part of their marketing that they actually had syrup containers. This is actual original Aunt Jemima's syrup container from the 1950s. And so if you collected so many box tops, you could get one of these in the mail. And then over time, they tried to soften the image of Aunt Jemima. Here, if you see, they sort of got rid of the maid uniform and they gave her a nice hairdo and some pearls and that, and to try to make it a little bit more contemporary. And then after everything that's happened with the social justice movements, they just realized, well, maybe Aunt Jemima has run her course. And the marketing people said, we recognize Aunt Jemima's origins are based on a racial stereotype. And while work has been done over the years to update the brand in a manner intended to be appropriate and respectful, we realize these changes are not enough. So now they have retired the image, or they're planning to, so many of these images won't even be around, I would imagine, in the coming year. So they're going to probably change the name and actually change the imaging. So it'll be interesting to see what that looks like going into the future. And what do you think that will look like? And can these images be updated? Should they just go away? And then how do we deal with history around these images? So after Aunt Jemima was starting to be retired, then the commercial, all forms of companies started to think, well, maybe we need to think about other images as well. So Uncle Ben's rice, just like Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben, and he was a sort of a servant type individual. And so that image actually is starting to be retired. Now they're looking at changing that. The cream of wheat guy who's also a chef, and that comes out of this history as well. Actually, this was called the Plantation Trio. Aunt Jemima was Uncle Ben's and cream of wheat, the Plantation Trio, because the images are so deeply embedded in history. So all of these are starting to go. And even Mrs. Butterworth, she's going down too. And so, and they thought that it was too reminiscent of Aunt Jemima and Mammy and kind of black women being servants and domestics and that. So the images are starting to change over time, I think, some interesting ways. And people sometimes don't think, well, why is this even important? Well, if you don't see other images of yourself, particularly as African Americans, and the message is that all you can do is be a servant and be a caregiver, and there's nothing else, that tends not to be so healthy for people. And to see people in the full range of who they can be, and that this is not like our inherent nature of being in the world. So these images, we're starting to unpack all of these images, so it's an interesting historical time there as well. Another common image we'll see, I think that we're dealing with now, is this image of the angry black woman. And Kamala Harris, the first Jamaican and Indian woman of color who is the vice presidential nominee this year, one image that we see, and we see that in the research oftentimes extensively, is this image of her being angry, aggressive, hyper-violent. And so that image is really powerful because what it does, the message is that our anger is not justifiable and doesn't need to be taken seriously. So even though these images exist all throughout the media, they actually get inflicted or directed at African American women. And so it's an interesting time as we live through this particular social justice movement, how those images will play out. And as we move forward, can society really start to see black women in their fullest dimensions, and how that can happen? So I've been really fascinated to see how that will unfold. Another image I spend a lot of time working on is the Black Superwoman image and the historical implications of that. So maybe before I talk about that image, maybe I'll go get a guest speaker to help me. Okay, so I'll admit it. As a kid, I was fascinated by superheroes. That was just always intriguing to me, and I especially liked Wonder Woman because she had this crown that she could take off and throw it and blow things up, and she had these cool cuffs, and so they could be used as weapons as well. So I was always fascinated by super women and superheroes, and when the Black Panther movie came out, and it was really exciting to be able to see African American women as superheroes. But here's a problem as I do this research, that there are some limitations, though, of being this kind of Wonder Woman character. And there's actually a body of research that suggests that that's one character that African American women tend to internalize in some ways that end up not always being so healthy. This kind of message that because we're dealing with Mammy, because we're dealing with the angry Black woman, because we have excessive expectations about who we should be, sometimes people take on this characteristic that I should be able to be the constant caregiver, to do everything correctly, to meet everybody's needs to the point where I don't have any needs or desires or interests of my own, and I don't need help. I don't need to reach out for help. I don't need support. I can just do everything on my own. And so in some ways, there are advantages to that image in that you can appear to get a lot of things done and be quite successful doing it. But now we're getting more research that suggests the mental health dynamics of that, the depression, the anxiety, and sometimes a sense of failure when you can't accomplish everything. It's not so great for people. So as I move forward with my research in 2020 and beyond, I've actually started going around the country and talking to women of color, but people of all ethnic backgrounds, about what are the consequences and the challenges of sort of embracing this superwoman and superhuman image of who and what we can be. And so one thing I've learned, I think probably the most important thing I've learned with the pandemic and that shaped my life now and my research going forward is maybe it doesn't really matter all that much what your ethnic background is, what your gender identity is, that if we really want to be healthy, maybe we need to retire many of these images and really work toward just living the most authentic life that we can, realizing that it's a pandemic. Some days will be good, some days will be bad. You'll feel like a superhuman sometimes. You'll get things done. Some days will be less than perfect. And just figuring out how you're going to move forward and have the best life that you can and just do the best work that you can. And part of that means really escaping the cape. So that's what I would leave. That's the most important thing I've learned during the pandemic. That sometimes it's really important to just escape the cape, not just try to be a superhuman in the work that we do, and just strive for just human. And so with that, I think I'm going to go escape the cape.
Hi, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce to you and have a conversation with Dr. Carolyn West, a faculty member at University of Washington Tacoma and a psychologist. And so welcome, Dr. West, and thank you so much for the work that you provided for us for your lecture.
Thank you so much for having me.
And some of the materials you provided for us also. So when I looked at some of your work, the first thing that I linked to and that I opened up was your Grandma Moselle digital story, which was the first thing I connected to. And when I started watching that story of Grandma Moselle, I had these sensations of collard greens, of sweet potato pie, of the sound of Mahalia Jackson, and women in beautiful hats. Talk about what you were trying to create and the sensation you were trying to create in your video about Grandma Moselle.
For me, I was trying to create the sensation of what it was like to grow up in that household and be surrounded by that richness and that Southern culture that has always stayed with me and always just provided a sense of comfort and familiarity. It was really important to me. And safety.
What are those sensations, the smell of collard greens? For those who don't know what it means to have collard greens in a kitchen and sweet potato pie on the table and Black women in hats, what does all that symbolize for you? And what's the sensation that brings for you? Because it certainly brought a sensation for me.
So what those images evoked for me is being at Sunday services with my grandma and being surrounded by these older Black women, many of them domestics. They didn't have great titles or great degrees, but they walked through the world with such dignity and grace and knowing who they were. And those hats were called Sunday crowns. So on Sunday, they could just be majestic and wanting to aspire to being those women, regardless of how challenging life could be. And then going home on Sunday and having family members come over and the smell of collard greens and sweet potato pies and all the love and care that they, despite being so tired from the work week, they would spend that time preparing these fabulous meals with so much love and care, and the warmth and safety that evoked was what I was trying to elicit in that video.
So for so many children and so many children of African descent who might have gone to church with their grandmothers or mothers, those Sunday crowns would mean something because you'd walk in to a chorus of women wearing these hats, and they became images that were that of art, images of art, really not?
Exactly. That was their art. That was their artistry in some way, and the Southern cuisine was their artistry as well.
Right. And all day matter, if not an all weekend. It could take days to cook collard greens. You said, in me, and this is a quote, in me, Grandma Moselle cultivated a fierce independence. She had that kind of impact on you. Mm-hmm. I see the word resilient on your shirt. Is that connected to Grandma Moselle in some way?
It's connected to her, and it's connected to all of us these days. And just a reminder, as we live through COVID, as we live through the aftermath of an election, as we live through racial justice and injustice and trying to make sense of what all of that means, even though we're maybe not feeling so resilient, we are. And then remembering to tap into that in whatever form that shows up for every person.
You posed a powerful question in that video. It was a rhetorical question, but it was, why was Grandpa George so sad? Why was he so angry? Tell me about that question. Tell us about that question. Why was he so sad and why was he so angry? And why was that question important to you?
The question was so important to me because I didn't understand it as a child in the Jim Crow era that he lived through, where they were exposed to lynching and racial terrorism, that even though we're living through that today, living through it in a different way, because you turn on the television and you see George Floyd and that kind of institutional state violence inflicted on the bodies of African Americans, but they were living through that on a daily basis, of not being able to use restrooms because of the color of their skin, having to go through the back door, not being allowed to get education. And that kind of racial terror and trauma, it's just unfathomable to me, which draws me into understanding resilience in a different way, but understanding why he carried a lot of anger and sad and grief that it wasn't even safe to articulate.
So it's important to recognize these as injuries, whether we carry them overtly or covertly, but they're injuries that could well be passed down from one generation to the next. you invoke the name George Floyd. I want to come back to that in a moment. That pain that Grandpa George felt and experienced and its impact on you, did that have a connection to your desire to become a psychologist? Because you're a clinical psychologist at UW Tacoma. Let me ask that question differently. You went to school you did your undergraduate work at the University of Missouri. But I want to go back to Dr. West, or before, to Carolyn West, when you were in high school, and how you chose to study at University of Missouri, and how you chose what you did at University of Missouri. So go back to when you were a young girl and how you chose the college that you did.
How I got here is that I was in the 8th grade, and the first book that I checked out with my adult library card, you had to be 13 years old to go to the adult section of the library. And the first book I checked out was a book called Scream Quietly or the Neighbors Will Hear. And it was one of the first sort of academic studies on intimate partner violence and domestic violence. And I was reading about Dr. Murray Strauss, who had done the first national study on domestic violence. And I kept thinking, I want to do something to change this problem in society. And then I opened the World Book Encyclopedia. That was before like the internet, showing my age, before the internet was a thing. And it was a World Book Encyclopedia, and I found an entry for clinical psychologists, and I just knew that that's what I should be doing with the rest of my adult life. So I studied hard, got through high school, did really well in high school, and I got a 4-year scholarship to the University of Missouri in St. Louis. And I met my major professor there, who was a clinical psychologist as well. And she inspired me to do work on domestic violence. So I became her research assistant and got into the PhD program in clinical psychology and continued to work with her.
So you discovered this as early as 8th grade when you found literature.
Yes.
And a concept that inspired you, and you moved through with that work. And University of Missouri, did your undergraduate, and you were a first generation student at University of Missouri. What kind of meaning did that, what kind of challenges and opportunities of being a first generation student interested in psychology?
I had a really wonderful mentor, Dr. Susanna Rose, and we're still the best of friends today, and she's still a huge supporter to me. So I think what inspired me, she saw me as a faculty member. I did really well on the first exam in her female sexuality class, and she was handing back the exams, and she wanted to know who this really good student was. And we connected, and she saw me. Even though she was a white woman, she got diversity, and she understood racism, and she understood the challenges, and she reached out to me and helped me every step of the way. And she, in some ways, inspired me to become the professor that I am.
Mm-hmm. And you said at some point that you were an activist in graduate school, that you were quite active in grad school. Talk about what does activism in graduate school look like for you?
In some ways, I was an accidental activist. I just wanted to graduate from the program and get my PhD. But we had a problem with sexual harassment, and which is a common problem throughout the academic setting. And that was a problem at my campus as well. And I complained about it, and nothing really was being done. And there were no policies in place. And when I complained and nothing happened, I just teamed up with other students who were having a similar problem. And we started writing petitions and complaining, and it culminated in a lawsuit in my mid-20s, suing a university. This was well before the Me Too movement, and suing the universities and insisting that they change policy and protect survivors of sexual harassment. And that really shaped my life and the research that I do today.
So you do research around violence against women, harassment, partner violence, and violence against women in general. You write, when you're not teaching, you write about this, and you serve as an expert witness. Talk about what being an expert witness in a courthouse. Why have you chosen to do that work, and what's that work like for you?
In some ways, some work you choose and other work chooses you. But being an expert witness means that oftentimes I go into jails or prisons, or I go in and I talk to attorneys. Oftentimes when a survivor has used violence in self-defense and she's killed her intimate partner. And it's my job to go in and talk to attorneys, talk to judges, talk to survivors, and explain to the court system what were the dynamics of the violence? Why did she feel like she or he, sometimes I work with male victims as well, why did they feel like they had to use violence instead of just leaving? And why it's not as simple to leave these situations as people would think. So to really kind of understand, unpack the psychological dynamics of all of that so that jury members and judges can understand what exactly happened there.
During the year that, 2020, COVID-19 hits, you're on sabbatical, which is a period of time in which faculty can take a moment in time to refresh their research, to concentrate, to deepen their work. And during that time, COVID-19 hits. What was the impact of COVID-19 during 2020 on you?
The impact was profound in some ways. I was really concerned that I had many speaking engagements already set up and ready to go, and everything was canceled. But I knew that I wanted to write and do some scholarship anyway. So I thought, well, maybe it'll be fine. I'm not really going anywhere. But what happened was the whole world opened up at that point. Everybody was online, and I had to move all my scholarship, all my speaking engagements to a virtual format, which actually was a good thing because then I was really available to then work with the entire world around these issues. So I started doing virtual international workshops at that point. So in some ways, it connected me to people that I would not have otherwise met.
Mm-hmm. You developed a new metaphor for life. It's called watering the bamboo, and you speak about that in your video, and I'm looking over your shoulder, and it looks like there's a bamboo up there. Talk about the metaphor of watering the bamboo and why that has such powerful meaning for you.
Well, it's not even something that I created. It's been around for many decades, and even prior to that. But the whole notion is timber bamboo can grow up to 90 feet tall and just some incredible height. But the trick is you have to keep watering it. So sometimes it takes as long as 5 years to water this plant before it starts to grow. And so you start to feel over time, well, I'm working really hard. I'm investing everything in my career, everything in this work that I'm doing, and nothing seems to be happening. And then I just understood, as a colleague once said to me, Carolyn, just keep watering your bamboo. It'll happen, it'll take off, things will grow in ways that you had never anticipated. And so watering bamboo simply means for me, is just trusting this process that we all do and to keep investing in your career and keep going in the direction that you want to go, even though things don't seem like they're manifesting, they are. And while you're watering that bamboo, you're getting skills, you're meeting people, you're developing things that you need to do. So when you move into that next step of your life, you'll be prepared for it. And so trusting the process.
You did your talk in October. It's November now. October is Domestic Violence Month. What does it mean for a psychologist to work during this declaration of something called Domestic Violence Month? What does that mean to a psychologist? What does that month mean? And what does it mean now that we're in November? We're in the midst of a pandemic. We're in the midst of a recession, and it's winter time in the Pacific Northwest.
As an academic, as a domestic violence researcher, it means being very busy working with advocates and survivors and community members to really go in and educate around domestic violence. and what that means for all of our communities. And then I get busy again in April, which is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So the work continues all year around. So it doesn't have to be Domestic Violence Awareness Month. It doesn't have to be October to have these discussions. We're going through a pandemic. There's a recession, or there may be a recession, or at least economic challenges from everybody across the world. And so we'll see it, regrettably, we will see an uptick in domestic violence as people are shut in. They're dealing with all these social problems and economic concerns. So it's even more important to continue having that conversation about what domestic violence is and how we can make sure that everybody is safe during this time.
Part of your work as a psychologist, and out of interest, out of your own interest, you do work around images of Black women, images of African-American women, and the artifacts that are part of those images. Do you happen to have some artifacts with you? And tell us about what those artifacts mean to you and mean to us, and how powerful they've been in our culture.
This is a really powerful image that we have lived with for more than 100 years on our breakfast cereal. And to give you an example about why this image is so important, I recall being a young professor and being at a conference at a hotel restaurant, and an older white gentleman comes up to me. I'm dressed in my blue power suit and I've got a handful of books. And he comes up to me and he says, "Can you show me to my table and take my order?" And I thought, well, I clearly don't work here. But the reality is he's probably encountered more Black women in the role of domestic, of servant, in this position than he has encountered as a professional in an upscale hotel. So I study images because I want to understand, what are the impact of these images? How does this impact the lives of African-American women, how other people see us, and more importantly, how we see ourselves? And also there's resilience and power, though, because my grandmother was a domestic and she had so much dignity and grace. And I knew that Black women were so much more than what we were seeing in this packaging and in these images, that they had far more complex lives than what the media seemed to show us. So much of my work now focuses on unpacking, what do these images mean? How can we change them? And now with the Black Lives Matter movement, where the company is rebranding and taking away this image that dates to slavery and saying, we need to investigate and do a better job of the images that we depict of African Americans. So much of my work focuses on that now.
And you tell the story in your video about how these kinds of images and stories, fictional accounts in some cases, tie us back to post-emancipation and carry out these stories. And yes, in 2020, there have been some moves to actually change these images and take these images off of pancake boxes and syrups and such. So there's been some activism around this and some reaction to this. And I was thinking, after I'd seen your video, I went shopping for something and I walked into a store and I found Aunt Jemima's syrup. And I found myself thinking about your work and the importance of that, and the fact that some of these images still exist, and how important it is to actually know our history so these don't become subconscious kinds of images. It seems to me that's part of what you're getting at as well.
Exactly. So we have President-elect Kamala Harris, a woman of color who is going to be in one of the most powerful positions in our country. And we're still struggling with how we see African-American women of color. And so those stereotypes will still be hurled at her. And so if we can kind of step back and ask ourselves, where do those come from? And then how can we see Black women and women of color as multidimensional? Is going to be critical, especially during this time that we're living through now.
The psychology of this year of 2020 will be powerful in the sense that when we look back and treat this year, we have an image of George Floyd being killed in 2020. And then we have this powerful moment where Kamala Harris is indeed elected to be the vice president of the United States. So it's a historic moment. But those are two really identifying moments of 2020. As you look at those two moments, what do you see? What impact do they have on us, on you? How do you reflect on both George Floyd and Kamala Harris in the same year as a reflection of 2020?
I think that it's almost as if everything has changed and nothing has changed. And I think the challenge is holding both of those in our minds. So in other words, Kamala Harris being vice president, everything has changed. And so the world can see us in different ways, see the power of Black women, women of color, that we can ascend to these highest levels of positions. But at the same time, we're still dealing with this deep structural racism, also sexism and all these other forms of discrimination. And we're still living with that as well. So to understand that one thing doesn't necessarily change the other thing, and we still have to find ways of challenging that and moving forward. In fact, one thing that animates my work so much now around survivors of domestic violence is a quote by James Baldwin, when he said, if we wish to know how justice is administered in any country, we don't just listen to the judges or the police officers or the lawyers or the middle class who are very protected. We need to listen to the voices of those who are unprotected, who need the system to work for them best. We need to listen to their testimony, because that's how we make real change.
The fight for the unprotected has been part of your work and part of your journey, such that you've been inspired by the Superwoman myth, superheroes. You've been both inspired, but you remind us of some of the challenges and some of the things that we should be careful of, especially for women, especially for Black women. And so we've got Kamala Harris. So how does the Superwoman myth both inspire us, and what are some of your cautions around the superhero myth? Because at some point you inspire women to take the cape off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Escape the cape is something that is just really important to thinking through, especially as we live through this pandemic, because in some ways, I'm inspired by this long history of African-American women who in some ways have been superhuman, who have raised children on their own, who've been a part of social justice movements for hundreds of years, and have really made real change, who mobilized to help to get Kamala Harris in the White House. So I'm deeply inspired by these women, but at the same time, we also understand that trying to be superhuman and do all of these things with no social support ends really badly and is not really good for your mental and emotional health and well-being. So one thing that I try to do is during the pandemic, or just shortly before the pandemic hit, I went, and before my sabbatical started, I went to a monastery for a silent retreat. And I just sat in silence for as much of the time as I could and really thought about, who am I? What do I want to do? What do I want to be doing next with my life? And decided to get really much more clarity about focusing on what that should look like. So for me, taking off that superhuman cape is striving to be just human, not superhuman, to just be human. And that is good enough.
What advice do you give to all of us, students, community members, those of us who look to 2021 and just want to be well? Are there some tips? Are there some ideas? Is there some advice that you give to our community, a community yearning to be well now?
what I would leave students with, community members with, is a poem that I have that I keep close to my desk as I write and I start my day. And I think about it often. Audre Lorde, who is a poet, and she was a poet activist, and she was dealing with breast cancer. And so she knew that her time would be coming to an end very soon. And she wrote, "I want to live as much of my life, however long or short, with as much sweetness as I can decently manage, loving all the people I love, and doing as much of the work that I still have to do. I'm going to write fire until it comes out of my ears, my eyes, my nose, everywhere, until it's every breath that I breathe. And I'm going out like a meteor." And so those words inspire me every day to just remember to escape the cape, not try to be superhuman, just be human, realize that we're all trying to have this sort of abnormal, we're having a normal reaction to just a really abnormal time. We're all doing the best that we can, practice as much grace as I can for other people, hope those people will give me as much grace as they possibly can, and just write fire in my own research, and then just go out like a meteor and just trust that everything will be okay.
Dr. Carolyn West, your work is inspiring and important. Your colleagues and your students at University of Washington Tacoma love you. They're so proud of you. And we're proud of you across the University of Washington. Thank you for your years of service and for your years of scholarship and your devotion and commitment to the well-being of our community.
Thank you so much.